Making games is hard, and multiple indie devs work extremely hard, but few developers poured their hearts and souls into a title up to the point their heart actually stops working. Julian Ball, the developer and founder of Australian indie studio Flow, ended up in an ambulance getting his heart defibrillated, basically because he worked too hard on a title. All of the medical issues he faced, such as severe tachycardia, were caused by stress and self-imposed crunch. Ironically, while making a survival game. Would be something if a dev died working on a survival game. Fortunately, for everyone involved, that didn't happen. It is, however, just one aspect of how Lens Island came to be. Watching the documentary on their own game, you realize a few other extraordinary things happened, like Julian asking his gaming college teacher Martin to help him make Lens Island, and Martin accepting the job offered by his ambitious student instead of taking a lucrative offer somewhere else in the games industry. The documentary is worth a watch, I'll link it down below. After all of this, plus a successful Kickstarter, the game launched in early access in 2021, and recently, in December 2022, it got another major update called Uncharted Waters. I played the game when it launched in 2021, and I now played and finished Uncharted Waters by collecting most of the materials, building a thriving farm, and beating all the bosses. I'm glad to say that Lens Island improved a lot over 1 year, and it's definitely a game worth playing. Let's take a deep dive into this title today and see why. And also, to some extent, why not? Lens Island is a game that combines the open world building and farming sim genre with dungeon crawling including combat. Julian explains in a halfglassgaming.com interview, source in the description, that they wanted to treat both elements equally, unlike many other games do. It is fair to say they succeeded in this because the building and farming part of Lens Island is very elaborate and the combat and dungeons are rewarding and engaging. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to do both in the game, although you will miss out on a thing or two. For the most part, however, it is perfectly viable to be just farming and building without hardly doing any combat. You gain experience from gathering and farming, and quite a lot of it too, so you can develop your character and get better at combat without ever being in a fight. It is a good way to make the dungeons a lot easier if you so choose. If you're the kind of person that just loves to create a massive mansion and decorate the whole thing, you can do that, assuming you're willing to farm all the materials, of course. If you're more into exploration and survival and combat, you can do that too. And both aspects of the game are mature and feel good to play. Story-wise, this pretty indie game doesn't have a lot of narrative or plot, but the visual storytelling makes up for it at least somewhat. What you will find are a deserted town on an almost forgotten island, and you need to build that back up. However, below the islands lie several dungeons filled with void monsters and civilizations that used to exist underground, but now are desolate and ancient. It reminded me a little bit of the movies Lord of the Rings, The Mines of Moria. Very majestic, lots of stone and massive architecture, but also filled with monsters and even a troll. It's a stark contrast, the underground dungeons versus the god rays infused surface. In the caverns, you literally can't see shit, especially on a good monitor with good HDR. It is pitch black unless you bring a torch. Graphically, the game hasn't changed much, I feel, compared to last year, but it wasn't necessary either. It is still very pretty. More than pretty is the music. I noticed a whole bunch of new tracks being added, one even more beautiful and soothing than the other. Music composer Lars-Erik Fjesne Eide has arranged some of the best music I've ever heard in a video game, and I'm very particular about music in video games, to be honest. Not only are these scores simply very well written, have beautiful chord progressions and fit the island scenery well, also thematically the songs make sense. The songs are mostly written in the same key as far as I can tell, and more noticeably, the melodies are recurring throughout different songs, using little variations here and there like classical composers such as Bach used to do. It shows that this modern-day composer, Fjösne, isn't just making a bunch of songs to put into an indie game, which is a feeling I typically get, but that he's consciously thinking about creating a palette of songs that work together, songs that are recognizably familiar but still retain their own identity. There's just something about sailing across the seas, hearing a toned-down piano playing chords, and then softly hear the Lens Island main theme in the background, played by a guitar, piano, or wood instrument. It is a phenomenal soundtrack, already impressive on its own merits, but especially enticing while playing the game. Give this guy a medal or an award or something, it is so fucking good. And now that I've set the scene a bit, let's talk about the changes that were made regarding the gameplay since last year. Right off the bat I can tell you, this game has improved a lot. Multiple systems got overhauled, some new systems got added, and to test it all out, I started a new adventure. In the previous version of this early access game, there was a single dungeon, which was okay, but once you completed it, there wasn't much of a reason to return there apart from materials. The dungeon was also massive and not procedurally generated. At some point, you knew the layout. Enemies and resources had different spawn points, but the layout was known and always the same. The dungeon on the main island in patch 0.5, the current patch, the Uncharted Waters, is much smaller, holds a distinct minor boss encounter, and lets you save a blacksmith, who will then craft stuff for you. If you build him a house, that is. That also got changed. Because the town used to be a simple static town, where you could trade for blueprints and materials, get your farming supplies, and make boatloads of cash. It's much more restricted in the current version, and a progression system got added to the town. You need to provide the town with building materials so it can expand, and new plots of land become available, as well as certain buildings such as a mining outpost, which gives you stone, coal and iron. The plots of land you unlock you can use to house specific citizens, like the blacksmith we just saved, and only then will he open up his shop again in town, and only then can you make use of his services. This is an interesting and natural progression loop, and it's fun to do. You can go all out once again with the housing for these citizens, or be like me and give them the bare minimum, because it doesn't seem to matter. It would be cool if the bigger of a house you build them, the more discount you get in their shops or something, but as far as I can tell, that's not the case currently. Only upgrading the town impacts their selling and buying prices, not how lovely of a home you create for these people. There are more progression systems added, for example a skill tree. You can get experience from literally anything, whether it's crafting, farming, chopping wood or fighting enemies. That means that if you want to go mostly pacifist, which I think you can do to a large extent, you have that option, and you can specialize into certain parts of the skill tree that makes sense for you. For example, you can take faster gathering nodes, or more life, or more base damage with weapons, or one of my favorites, as I enjoy farming a lot, the node which lets the scythe only cut full-grown crops. Super useful, that one. There are quite a few options to choose from, and this system adds another layer of depth to Lens Island. A little side note here, I found the pacing of Lens Island to be very balanced. You never get the idea you need to grind overly hard, or that the game and specifically the dungeons are unfair, barring one or two exceptions. I always had a clear goal in mind and a clear idea how to get to that goal, and the game didn't ask inhumane grinding in return. That's great, because this is a fairly casual game. So it's important to me as a fairly casual gamer that gathering and crafting isn't overly tedious. The only aspect of pacing that felt a little bit like bullshit are the boss fights, because there's a massive spike in difficulty out of nowhere and a massive drop in frame rate, which didn't help. I'll talk about that soon. By far the biggest thing this expansion adds, however, is exploration of the new world map, with various islands, a big sea and plenty of other points of interest. It's super fun traveling on your raft, or later a glider, to discover additional islands. The game uses the map to indicate which dungeons you should tackle next, and you need to unlock dungeons by activating 3 runestones, and those are found in other dungeons on islands. But even if you're not doing that, you will want to explore, because you can find different resources on these other islands, like hardwood. I also noticed that even smaller islands that aren't related to the game's progression or quests or story are still worth visiting because they conveniently group certain resources together in a small area, like a whole bunch of flowers, which sell back at home for a premium. You can encounter ruins, which you can deconstruct for easy access to stone and wood, or you may encounter a fishing spot in the sea with 3 or more pools of fish, which you can either cook for your own convenience or sell as raw fish to the fishermen back home. While I still absolutely love Lens Island and had a great time playing it, there are a few negatives I would like to point out. For example, performance, specifically frame rate drops. Performance isn't great, to be honest, and while the game is mostly playable, the frame rate drops are noticeable and occur frequently. It didn't bother me too much at the start, as this isn't a tense action game, until I reached an actual boss and the frame rate tanked once more, and all of a sudden this was a pretty big issue. I got hit multiple times because of the drops by the boss. I ultimately lost the fight, and this was not a great experience. Some optimization fixes are definitely required. Sure, I'm playing on the highest settings, but I have a very decent PC that should run this easily. Also, frame rates fluctuate massively, indicating it's not my system but the optimization. In boss fights, with a lot of enemies on screen and a lot of stuff going on, the CPU just doesn't seem to keep up. Another point of criticism, although some new enemies were added over the course of a year, is the enemy variety. Lens Island has very few enemy types, maybe 6 or so, and 2 bosses. That's not a lot for a game with 10 dungeons and a focus on combat and dungeon crawling. Some additional monsters would make the dungeons more interesting and more unique. I praised the music earlier on, but I can't say the same for sound mixing. It is completely off in some parts of the game, with music being way too loud, especially in endgame dungeons. However, it's not just music. Certain sound effects, in particular those on bosses, are seemingly twice as loud as any other sound in the rest of the game, and the final boss is not only a shit show in terms of frame rate, also in terms of sound design. The fight is literally all over the place. It's pretty bad, but fortunately it's only in a few places, and this should be an easy fix. It is just sliding some sliders in the mix. Just exploring islands with music and gathering sounds that works flawlessly. As soon as you get into dungeons, the sound mixing needs work. My final criticism, and this will heavily depend on you as a player to what extent this applies, but it's the longevity of the game. While Lens Island has many beautiful aspects which I tried to highlight, at this moment in time, January 2023, the game has rather limited playtime. I personally think that's fine because the playtime you do get has high quality, mostly, but competition is fierce. And if you're looking for a builder with vibrant NPCs or a good story or changing and random environments or something that keeps you interested for more than 20 hours, let's say, then I'm not so sure you're going to enjoy this title. Because ultimately there isn't an awful lot here yet, in terms of content. Sure, a lot more than a year ago, but a lot less than comparable titles, even early access titles. It's something to take into account. I think 20 hours of game time at this point is a decent estimation that easily lets you crawl all the dungeons, kill all available bosses, and leaves you another 8 hours or so to build a majestic mansion and farm and buy all the stuff, if you so please. Good thing is, we're only like halfway through early access. I just thought I would check up on the game, see where we're at. The 1.0 version is supposed to launch in roughly a year, with features like a bigger world with different forms of random generation, more enemies, bosses and dungeons, more detailed and complex farming and home builds, new biomes and islands, potentially co-op multiplayer, and new game modes and custom game mode tools. So still, there is a very bright future for Flow Studio. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Lens Island. Thanks for watching and making it to the end. I'll see you in the next one, and don't forget to subscribe for more indie game content. Love you all. See you soon. Bye bye.